The year was 1988. It was the end of August or the 1st of September. The place is Lacygne, Kansas, to Amoret, Missouri, to Amsterdam, Missouri. My boss had just bought close to a section of land, which means about 640 acres. It was in these three separate locations coming together, creating a triangle, with the point being in Kansas. Understand it wasn't the entire area within the triangle, but the majority of the properties were located in it. The property he had just acquired spent the entire spring and summer seasons growing their pastures so that by the time we took possession, they were about 5 feet tall with various weeds and grasses, which we immediately went to work getting mowed down, and if it was worth the trouble, it would be baled. Otherwise, if the cut stuff was too thin, then I would just mow over it again so it was chopped up better and the cattle would eat it. I should perhaps also mention he had been raising cattle in that area before buying the large amount of land, so he had plenty of cattle there to move on to the new land. I started out mowing on the high side of the property and worked my way down to where there was a creek and some trees, which gradually became thicker until there was no sense in trying to mow because the trees had become too many. If you went far enough into the forest, you would eventually encounter a lake, which was the result of coal mining. Since it was early September, the days were still warm. The stuff I was mowing was mostly finished with its cycle for the year, leaving a lot of really dried tall weeds which had died. They were just waiting to be mowed, which then sent a ton of small pieces of dried grass and dried weeds into the air, creating a cloud of dust. The ability to see more than a few feet was greatly inhibited. As the day passed, I mowed even further down the slope of the hillside toward the creek, which ran through the lowest elevation on the property. On occasion, I would find it necessary to stop the tractor and climb down from the cab, which was air-conditioned, to move a dead tree branch out of the way. Another time, I had to move a 5-gallon can which had been left out there to rust. While outside the tractor cab and down on the ground, I began to feel like something was off. As mentioned, I couldn't see much more than maybe 20 feet in any one direction while the mower was in operation because it was constantly kicking up more debris into the air. I thought I spotted something dark and tall moving around in the area where the trees were the thickest. I decided to get back in the tractor cab and mow my way down to where I was going to stop and have a better look. When the tractor reached the spot near where I had seen the tall, dark thing moving in the trees, I stopped. I exited the tractor and stood there dumbfounded. How could that be? I must have made a mistake, but how? According to my figures, whatever it was that I had seen was close to 10 feet tall. And then I thought maybe the angle of my location combined with the angle of the slope of the landscape had all conspired to fool me. Sure, it kind of made sense, and since I was looking across at something which was also on a slope, and I had used as limb which was closer to me than the thing I saw to mark its height, maybe it caused my figures to be off. Otherwise, such a conclusion was ridiculous. Despite that conclusion, I don't mind admitting I was quick to get back into the safety of the tractor cab. Surrounded on three sides with mowers, all whirling at high RPMs, I felt pretty safe. It allowed me to get closer to the thicker part of the trees, where I could look further into the forest beyond and see if I could spot what it was that had been moving. Suddenly, on one of my passes, 10 to 15 foot tall tree came soaring out of the forest, and with the root ball still attached. It struck the side of the cab like a meteorite had fell out of the sky. I was completely taken by surprise. Kicked the tractor into higher gear and let it take me away from the spot. I drove the tractor back up the slope toward the blacktop road, which ran along next to the property. Once I had reached a distance which I thought was safe, I stopped the tractor so I could have a good look at the damage done, as the tree, after hitting the side of the cab, had fell into the running mower. It caused an extreme amount of horrible noise which I cannot describe in just having a 10 or 15 foot tree thrown into them with the ball root still attached is going to cause some serious backlash when those blinding fast sharp mower blades come into contact with the tree and the root ball. I had turned the mower off as soon as I realized my situation, but it merely caused the blades to be caught at a slowed speed when the whole thing became lodged. If I had not shut down the mowers when I did, it would have resulted in the gearboxes above the mower blades to literally explode, a very dangerous circuit. The root ball of the tree had become so lodged into the mower that I had to back the whole thing up, making it go the opposite direction in which it was supposed to go in order to pull the pressure off. This took time, and the entire duration I kept looking at those trees. It was dark back into that thick of them, and I wondered what was it at all possible that I saw what I saw. 10 feet tall is akin to a story that is 10 feet tall. This was not news I wanted to carry back to my boss, that a creature 10 feet tall was roaming loose in his pasture, which would very soon be used to keep his cattle. And I finally had to conclude that I was mistaken. I didn't like admitting it, but what was the alternative? 10-foot tall monsters just don't happen in Kansas, or Missouri, as we were technically on the Missouri side of the border. I took the tractor and mower up near the gate entrance to the property. Then I got out and figured out how to dislodge the tree from the mower blades. By the time I had cleaned up the mower and did what I could for the cracked window, it was starting to look like a storm was blowing in, so I went ahead and drove the mower and tractor back to the barn where it is kept. It wasn't quite quitting time, so I decided to drive my vehicle out to the pasture where I had been mowing and have another look at that part of the property where the tree had been launched. I drive a small pickup truck. It isn't anything I would choose to take four-wheeling, but it suffices for getting a person across the pasture. So I drove down to where the creek lays at the lowest point of the property. On each side of it, the land lazily rises until the one side reaches the blacktop road and the other side fades into the thicker and thicker growth of the pin oaks and maple trees. It makes perfect sense these creatures would seek out forests which are made up of trees which can support very heavy weights if they were spending any time in them. The wide tree trunks provide a perfect cover for something which has shoulders 4 feet or more. The property was adjacent to land which had a stream running through it. All the property which my boss had bought was former coal owned, and part of the rules for digging coal is you have to leave the area, which is usually a big hole in the ground, in good shape. So it fills up with water. Well, you have to stock the newly created lake with a certain number of a variety of types of fish, and it leaves the land with a great lake on it and that is stocked with quality fish species. If one was to approach the matter from a Sasquatch point of view, it is easy to understand why the creatures have chosen that area. My boss was raising cattle on the land he bought. Easy prey for large predators, especially if calves are taken, which might not even be missed. The pasture which I had been mowing when the tree was thrown into the tractor cab did not have any cattle moved into it. However, it was not far off, which is why I was there mowing it in the first place. I would guess the boss likes to be able to keep count of his cattle, and if the pasture is really tall with growth, it probably becomes nearly impossible to keep straight which ones were counted and those yet to be. Plus, the taller growth would have provided much easier ambush for predators. Well, I drove down along the creek and stared up into the forest. By then, the overcast clouds had reached the location, and it greatly hurried in that evening's darkness. It got dark so fast, in fact, that I ended up turning my truck so that it was perpendicular to the path the creek went, and I aimed my headlights up slope which climbed away from the creek so I could see into the forest. Understand, when you're in a situation where darkness is arriving, it is natural to see or think you see things which may or may not be there, or that were not what your imagination might have first thought. In short, when you think you see something really big moving in the spot where there had previously been darkness, a lot of things can happen to fool your mind. Shadows can react unexpectedly for various reasons. Birds roosting can be startled by the sudden light, and then they will fly either down to the ground or to another nearby tree limb. If the bird is dark in color, it can give the impression of something being very tall having moved, when in fact it was just the bird. You think you saw movement, and your mind tricks you thinking that you saw movement all the way to the ground because it's a natural thing to expect. It only makes sense, so it is a conclusion which your mind allows without ever questioning it. Well, imagine my surprise when I ran into the first of what I quickly discovered were many trees, all about 10 or 15 feet in height, that had been thrown out into the mowed part of the pasture. And because it was nearing dark, I had not noticed them laying out there. I don't know why I didn't get scared, or more scared, and jump into my truck and take off as fast as possible. Instead, I foolishly got out of my truck and was using the headlights to illuminate the tree, and most notably its root ball, because I was wondering what the heck was doing that to the trees. It hadn't occurred to me that something living was the cause of the matter. I know it sounds stupid of me now, but at the time I was thinking the first tree that hit my tractor must have somehow been thrown up toward the cab when I ran over it with the front tires. That was really the only possible answer. Well, dirt can be attached to the roots of a plant or a tree and not weigh a whole lot. It doesn't happen often, but it can happen, especially if it's something which has a lot of roots that are actually holding just a small amount of dirt. And it isn't out of the realm of possibilities that such a dead tree or recently uprooted living tree might have been run over at just at the right angle to kick it up so it hit right on against my cab. I would have never went back out there if I had thought there was something strong enough to throw a tree that size, let alone wrench it out of the ground. If something big and strong enough to wrench those trees from the ground and then throw them through the air at the tractor cab was alive and out there with me, well, I would have been terrified as a person could get. Which is what happened when it finally dawned on me, what my ignorant brain had not thought of until then, that this was not an accident. These trees did not get blown or knocked upwards from their perch in the ground. It was indeed all due to the strength of something which was living, and it was out there in that pasture with me. Right then, it must be. I wasn't gone that long, and all those trees littering the pasture must have taken a little while to pull out of the ground and throw out there in the way of the mower path. Whatever had done it was likely still there with me. Then the stench arrived, and in a manner which can be compared to thick house paint being poured over everything. I can honestly say I began to wonder if there was enough oxygen left in the air. The odor was awful. I began to wonder if I was under attack by an inaudible sound called infrasound, which happens on a level which we cannot hear, but the sound waves still accomplish any number of goals, which might include sending a feeling of calm, one of caution, or one of fear or dread. I learned from research that Bigfoot are often associated with using it. As for the fear or the dread, well, maybe it was sent using infrared sound, and maybe it was just common sense telling me to be afraid. I just know that the hair on the back of my neck stood up to the point I felt it happen, and the same was true of the hair on my arms. And the way that stench hit me was all at once and seemingly from all directions at the same time. If I didn't have the cab in my truck as a desired destination, I could have ran in any direction and not been certain it would not deliver me right into the sharp teeth of the very thing I was seeking to avoid. However, overwhelmed by that sudden stench of what I would describe as death dipped in sour swamp mud, I still regained the sense of where my truck was at in relation to my current location, and I began to backpedal until I had reached my truck. And without taking my eyes off what might be coming from the darkness ahead of me, I opened the driver's side door and got in. Suddenly, just then, I saw something flash into view. It was another of the trees with the root ball attached. It came soaring into view, exploding into a ball of dust when it hit the ground in front of my truck, and I could hear the many small dirt chunks which had been caused to go flying hit the cab of the truck with some force. Suddenly, just then, I saw something flash into view. It was another of the trees which the root ball attached. It came soaring into view, exploding into a ball of dust when it hit the ground in front of my truck. I could hear the many small dirt chunks which had been caused to go flying hit the cab of the truck with some force. I threw the transmission into drive and threw some dirt behind me as I spun the truck around, so I was leaving the pasture. I was beyond terrified, mostly due to the horrible stench and the way it seemed to arrive on the scene from all directions at the same time. Fear had such a hold on me that I had to force myself to get out of the truck and go open the fence gate. I was just sure something would come out of the darkness and get me before I was finished with my task. That was not the case, however. I told my boss the next day what I had experienced, and he had myself and about half a dozen others go armed into the thick part of the forest, but we found nothing. The place was very spooky, and I wasn't the only one who felt like something was watching us, but we found no physical evidence of anything large living in there. Despite that fact, I was never comfortable the entire time, and even my boss had to admit the sight of all those trees with their root balls still attached made him confused for an answer. I'll be honest, many of the trees were pin oaks, worth about $1.50 to $200 each if they had been dug and balled, which is merely when you wrap the dug root ball in burlap. It was, of course, anybody's guess whether these trees would ever survive, but the way they had been removed from the ground, most looked like they still had their main root, which is all important. My boss was actually someone who sold trees and sawed for his main living. While he had some of us searching for the forest, he had others gather the trees which had been apparently ripped from the ground, and they were all placed ball roots into the water of the creek. The old man said he would have them picked up and brought to his nursery, where they would plant them in a dirt and peat moss mixture, which also had other things in it which would encourage them not to die. And if they proved to live, they would be balled and sold. That's a lot of work done for them. We finished our business and everyone left the pasture. Nothing new was discovered. There was no reason to revisit the location until the time came when the cattle were moved into the pasture and they needed some hay to go along with the stuff they were already eating. I went out there to move around some large bales of hay. Usually I was out in front of the cattle, getting the next pasture ready for them, and to be honest, I hadn't really given the place much thought after that day we searched the woods. Of course, upon being sent back there now, it was very much on my mind. The cattle were suspiciously up by the road. It was generally uncommon for the cattle to prefer to be near the blacktop. Just my observation. Normally, they seemed to prefer to gather in a group at the back of the property, and sometimes they would be strung out all over the place. I would suggest that for some reason unknown to us, that they feel comfortable in one pasture and in another they will congregate at the back corner of the property. That is what I would call normal, unusual activity. When they congregate near the blacktop, I say something very unusual is going on. Since this was the pasture where I had all those problems, I was leaning hard towards the fact that there was something down there in those thicker trees, and the cows knew it. It was mid-morning, and the sun was shining. There was just a slight breeze and very few clouds in the sky, and I decided to drive the tractor down there and run past the line along the thicker trees just to see what would happen. And I was in the same tractor as the one I was in before when I was attacked. This time I didn't have the mowers surrounding me, however. I crossed the creek at the only spot on the property where it was easily done. The length of the creek is the lowest point on the property. It sort of sets in a V shape, with the creek being the bottom of the V shape, and then the landscape slopes up and away from there. And I crossed along the side of the creek closest to the forest, which would be on the opposite side of where you enter the property from the blacktop. Suddenly I was surprised by an unwelcome trespasser. It came charging out of the trees and ran up, smashing in the side cab window of the tractor. As this was happening, I had seen it coming before it got to the tractor, so I immediately began to switch into a faster gear so I could get away. As the creature smashed the window, I let go of the clutch, and the tractor yanked itself into higher gear, which I followed by pushing the lever which controls how fast the engine idles. And I turned it all the way up, causing the tractor to roar, and then race toward the end of the property, where waited a barbed wire fence, which was supported by a line of hedge trees. I had time to note the creature was almost pitch black, and fur or hair was shiny, and if I didn't know better, I would have said that it had been recently shampooed. Though I know that's a crazy thought, but then again, what about this isn't? And the length of the hair or the fur was not long, especially around its face, which was a terrifying expression of hate and desire to do me physical harm. I had little doubt of that fact. The sound of the glass breaking really added to the drama of the moment, at least for me. Breaking glass always is a head turner in my case, as it just screams a serious accident or the like has happened. I should have perhaps described the glass as being shattered, but it did not break completely out of the cab. I would guess some of the blow from the creature was taken at a glance, what with the tractor having been moved into the higher gear and then my hitting the acceleration as fast as it would go. The tractor likely had already done its initial surge forward by my popping the clutch, and at that last split second, by the time the beast made contact with the glass, and the place it made contact would have been further back because it was slightly behind where I was sitting. Understand, I still had some problems. The most pressing was the fact that I was racing across the field, which was quickly running out of room. I had to get the tractor slowed down and then turned around because the creek, as I mentioned, only had one crossable spot. Everywhere else, it was cut too deep into the landscape for a tractor to be able to get across. And even more so because I had the attachment to carry the large hay bales on the back of it, which meant I would have gotten high centered very easily if I tried to cross the creek any other spot. That meant I had to go back past the creature. After getting the tractor turned around so I could make my run for the creek crossing, I saw the creature was no place in sight. What was it? A Bigfoot? It had to be. This one seemed to be a better physical version, however. It didn't seem to be quite so fat, for lack of a better way to describe it. This creature seemed to be all arms and legs. It didn't have a neck, I'll admit that much. It had in common with the Patterson Bigfoot. The hair or fur didn't seem as long either. Then again, Kansas isn't as far north as where Patterson did his filming. it would make sense the Sasquatch in that area would be fitted with a longer and probably denser version of hair or fur. I raced the tractor back past the spot where the creature had come out and attacked me. And then I crossed back over the creek and headed up the slope toward the gate, which I was going to have to get out and open, and this time close and lock since there were cattle in the field. I wasn't really sure whether I should trap the cattle in there with that thing, but I figured having them out wandering on the blacktop was not going to end well either. Since the Bigfoot would only take a cow or two and not sue for causing an accident, it seemed like the wiser choice. Besides, there's no positive proof Bigfoot even likes beef. However, if he exists and he eats meat, I suspect he likes beef. So anyways, I still needed to summon the courage to get out of the tractor cab and open the gate. When I arrived at the top of the slope, I was able to look back down and see there was probably a football field and a half of open pasture, which meant if the creature was hiding behind even close trees, that he would have to cover that football field and a half of distance before he got to me. Now, I'm not going to lie, I wasn't too sure I could make it back into the cab of the tractor before that thing was able to cross the area I mentioned. It was on the tractor the first time so fast that I had no clue how far it had come. But not being stupid, I could figure it was going to cover ground very fast with the kind of stride something that big would likely have, though I hadn't really observed it being beyond having it jumping up at the cab fist first and then smashing against the window. So basically I decided it was worth the risk, that I could probably make it back into the cab. Keep in mind the cab sits up and there is a bit of a climb involved to get up into it. It's a 4020 John Deere, which, on a side note, had been on television news once, although all you could see of it was the exhaust smokestack because the rest of it was underwater. It had been caught in a big flood. Now that I am thinking about it, the fact the fenders set the way that they do probably also helped curtail the strength of the beast when it smashed the cab window. It had to reach beyond the fenders to get to the window, which also speaks to the size of the beast. I would guess close to 10 feet. The whole moment seemed so surreal that even as I was getting out of the tractor cab and opening the gate, it began to feel like it had been a dream. I had a hard time believing that others who had seen such a beast didn't have at least a few seconds where they questioned themselves. Did that really happen? It's no different than if you lived in some unheard of location and Taylor Swift came walking up and asked you for a ride. That sort of stuff just doesn't happen, and if you think it did, you better have a look in the mirror before you go telling anybody else. Well, I unlocked the gate and moved the tractor outside the property and then got back out of the tractor cab and went to close the gate and lock it. I couldn't help but notice the cattle were again back in that far corner of the property, as far away from the area where I had encountered the beast as they could be. I hadn't given it any thought until I had climbed back up into the John Deere that this was going to go over with my boss like a balloon made of marble. I had literally no proof of anything having attacked the tractor. Then again, unless he was thinking that I did it myself on purpose, then what else would have caused that sort of injury? Getting 2 pieces of glass replaced on a tractor cab isn't cheap, mostly because of the size of the window, as we would find out. I drove back to the barn where the equipment is kept, going past the cattle all huddled in the corner of the property, and wondered what might be in store for them that night after I had obviously riled that creature. Next I wondered, or rather worried, there might be a cow about ready to have a calf. I wouldn't want to have a calf in that pasture with that creature wandering about. To be honest, I wouldn't want any cattle in there with it, but the boss can't just ignore that pasture because something which isn't supposed to exist is supposedly haunting the place. We searched the woods again the next day, which made me look bad, since there was again no sign of anything big living in there, and hard as I searched, I couldn't find any footprints. If not for having a good reputation already built in with the boss and the employees, it might have went different for me. The boss did, however, come to the conclusion that he had indeed had one of the cows give birth while in that pasture, and it couldn't be found where the calf